launch into something that's a little bit law-y, okay? So, how many of you knew all three of those stories? Okay, about half the hands. And what do you hear as commonalities or differences in those unbelievably brief little excerpts that tell the stories of the launching of these three different social movements? What do you hear? What strikes you? You can speak with your mouth full, I don't care. Yeah, go ahead, please.
A desire for power and equity.
Okay, a desire for power. Equity. What else? Yeah, like.
Seem to be bold.
Bold. That's got to be one of my favorite words. What else? Yeah.
Dichotomy.
Dichotomy. Say more about that.
Well, you have the dichotomy of the same versus the other, or in this case, they are the others in this sense for the civil rights they're fighting for it. And they're being defined by this.
Okay, so this I think, if we take out all of our scholarly and legal jargon, aren't we always just having this conversation, right? Which I refer to the Sesame Street conversation, like which of these things are like the other, which of these things do not belong, right? We sort ourselves and classify ourselves on a regular basis, and we are playing with a dichotomy. How are we alike? How are we different? Where do we have commonalities? And where do our interests, converge and diverge, right? Huge key concept. Yeah, please.
This nation's response to the oppression of few or minorities.
Okay, so the oppression of few or women, right? The few or the many way. The few or the many we'll put up there, right? Because of course it does. Women are not, minority, right? Numerical minorities, right? What else? Yes, Dean Brand.
Two things that are mine. One is the connectivity of the struggle, and the other one is a struggle for justice takes a long time. I'm just calculating. We're talking 165 years from Seneca.
Right, right, and so I'm gonna. As usual, Dean Brand is right, has his finger on the pulse, but the sense of connectivity between the struggles in such a long time. If you read any of the writings of Susan B. Anthony or Elizabeth Cady Stanton, you have a sense like for 50 years they at that time, travel all over the country making the same speech. We're not dangerous, right? At one point, when we might think we're thinking about letting Wyoming into the Union, and people are like, but they let women vote. This is in Congress. They're like, but they let women vote. And for a while, in the congressional reports, they're talking about how would we address them if they showed up in public, women, right? You know what I mean? So my point here is, right? Such a long time just to say you don't have to be afraid of us. Maybe we actually could participate and be included, and it might be okay. And 165 years, we just, how many days ago are women allowed to fight for the country fully, right? Okay. And then, did you hear the coverage about it? It was like, well, but we're going to have to see what they can actually do before we'll actually deploy them in various ways. And we might still have to make a lot of exceptions from women in combat, right? And my point is, we can even go back further, back to the connectivity part, because the abolitionists, slavery abolitionists, and the women's suffragists go way back before Seneca Falls. And the women do Seneca Falls because, let me just use a technical term, they're pissed that the abolitionists have not fully included them, when the men think maybe we're going to get something, the women are like, well, wait a minute, okay, what about us, right? So my point is, commonality differences. The suffragists and the abolitionists cut their teeth together as a social movement, and then eventually there was some splintering, right? Just as within all these movements, there's splintering on usually fighting about this. It's what we fight about today. We agree on the end, we'll fight to death. Like dueling banjos, over whose means are more likely to get us to the end faster, right? What's a banjo over here like? We need to be race conscious. That's the only way we're going to dismantle racism. We need to never ever see race or talk about race. Otherwise, if we're not colorblind, then we're just being racist, and that's perpetuating the problem. That is a debate over means, right? Debate over whether to be conscious of the trait or blind to the trait as a better end toward what? And what is the end here? I mean, what is ultimately the end here? And here are some of the things, right? To have a sense of power, to have a sense of equity, to boldly declare that, right? To either embrace or reject or understand these dichotomies, to fight that oppression, to see the connections, the connectivity, the interconnectedness, the intersectionality between basically social movements for justice, right? And we were playing off of Jamal and I, as we were talking about this, we're playing off of President Obama's choice in his speech to link Seneca Falls with Selma, with Stonewall. These are all social movements for justice, right? But I want to just remind you, and if you have not read it, it is called, there's a fantastic book about California's history called The Color of America Has Changed, written by a historian, Mark Brilliant. And this will tell you and link to Seneca Falls and Selma and Stonewall all the issues about the denial of title to Japanese Americans, the so-called the Alien Land Act here in California, right? The battles and the denials of bilingual education and the right for farm workers to, here's an idea which we're still fighting for, maybe get a minimum wage as opposed to being exploited overtly by not having all the same labor laws as apply to other workers. The forced segregation in our schools, the anti-miscegenation laws right here in California. So if you want to expand the horizons and look at many of the ways in which race and sex, and we're still all living through Prop 8, which hangs before the Supreme Court now, and sexuality are all sort of linked here, even in California, I highly recommend this. And more than anything else, if I could just leave you with one thought, which I'm not nearly done yet, but so I don't want you to think that, oh, she's almost done, because I have still a lot of time to go. If I could leave you with one thought, I would desperately encourage you to think also back to the history, to link what's happening now with the history. Let me give you a couple examples. If you look at what happened with just Prop 8, which you guys are all familiar with, you all watched it play out in the newspapers every day, right? And we have this notion, like the court, there's discrimination, and then we go to the courts, and the courts say no discrimination based on marriage, and then the people are like, we like the discrimination, we're going to pass an initiative, we're going to amend our Constitution, maybe the governor's going to defend it, maybe he's not going to defend it. All these things that we talked about, the media came to school and asked all of the professors here, can they do this? Can the voters pass this initiative? Can the governor not defend it? Every single one of these tactics legally happened with regard to Mexican Americans and Chinese Americans and Japanese Americans right here in California in prior initiatives, prior battles, and prior engagements, right? So my point is that a lot of these tactics are not new. It seems to me at the end of the day, we are talking about how we reach our aspirations. And we do not reach our aspirations. I would agree with all the critics who say, all the critical legal scholars of all sorts who say, law reform is never the answer. I'm going to agree with that insofar as, is law reform the answer? Is it the end? Is it the solution by itself? No. But what I deeply disagree with regard to many critical scholars, is the notion that law is somehow absolute, that law has no power. In fact, I would suggest to you, if you look both in California, nationally, or even globally, at social movements where people are trying to be included, right? And to no longer be excluded, and to affirmatively be included. Law is always the language in which the conversation occurs. It is the forum in which the battle plays out. Not that it's everything, but it's not nothing, right? And so the tools that you guys are all here to learn, I think, are incredibly valuable and important. In every social movement in history, we know that it's played out in legal terms. I mean, as the women sat down at Seneca Falls, they looked at the Declaration of Independence and they're like, yes, that's our point, right? right? I mean, literally just mirroring that same thing, okay? So if you'll accept for a second that it seems to me law is going to be how we have this conversation. And I really just think history defies the claim that it's not, okay? So if law is how we're going to at least have the conversation, then you can also see how we are stuck in our legal conversation in a series of binaries ourselves, right? And I think they very much are about if somehow equality or justice are the means, or excuse me, are the ends, or that's our goal, and the question is, how do we get there? Now this brings me back to the dueling banjos, right? And I always sing that out because I know that stays in your head. You're like, he's crazy. She gets up there and sings that song. But here's why, okay? My point is, are we trying to achieve truly, we're trying to dismantle subordination, anti-subordination? Is that what we're trying to do? Really dismantle, take it out? And to do that, maybe we have to be conscious of the traits. Maybe we have to look not just at intent, but at effects. Maybe we have to think carefully about how whites and racial minorities are not actually similarly situated, so why would we give them both strict scrutiny? Okay? Maybe we have to not just be backward looking, but we have to be forward looking and figure out how are we going to have meaningful intersectional diversity, okay? Maybe we have to recognize that identity is not necessarily fixed, right? It might be somewhat fluid. Who we are, how we identify, right? I mean, what makes Barack Obama black? As, for example, compared to white, right? I mean, why don't we refer to him as a white president just as comfortably as we refer to him as a black president, right? As you all know, identity is so socially constructed, right? It is so much a part of how we choose to classify ourselves. And our understandings and our social constructions change over time, right? And for those of us who do LGBT things, we're reminded of this on a daily basis, especially from our trans, brothers and sisters who are saying to us, no, wait a minute, right? Don't get too fixed about your categories of identity. And finally, and this really brings me back to my intersectional point here, which is we think in the law especially of identity as singular, one thing at a time, right? So if I have 3 identity characteristics about me, and I say, I got fired, I'm pretty sure it's for who I am, right? Well, first of all, if it's because I'm gay, that's illegal in the United States of America, okay? But if it's for other reasons, maybe it's not, right? But how does the law treat a person, who is, let's say, a racial minority, and female, and also a sexual minority of some sort? What do we do? You guys know the answer to this. You stand up here and you're like, here's like, take my, what is this, my left third first. Here's my race. Did they do it on that basis? Did they do something to me on the basis of my race alone? No, can't prove that. Okay, here, just take this part of me. Here's my gender. Did they do something to me based on my gender alone? I can't exactly prove that. Okay, then, no, you lose. Or let's just do, how about my sexuality? Do they do something to me based on my sexuality alone? This is what we do in law. We isolate the aspects of a person completely, not holistically, and we say, can that person prove that it's just either race alone, or gender alone, or sexuality alone? If not, done, clean, orderly, happy, fine, no harm, no foul, right? And you're left walking like, I just sort of feel like me all together every day, right? Like we all walk around with our own multiple identities. Our identities are not just singular, they're multiple, right? We have them and they're part of our holistic package, okay? So that brings me back to sort of, I don't have it up here, like an individual group dichotomy, okay? Right? So when we talk about what's happening with social movements, diversity, justice, inclusion, we usually talk about one group at a time, right? Okay? So we talk about Seneca Falls, that's the women, right? When in fact, the Seneca Falls Convention was women and men of all kinds of racial categories sitting together, okay? Including a lot of the abolitionist leaders. When we talk about Selma, who were the deaths in that little passage I reported, right? 2 whites from the north who had come down, right? So it was Selma, and similarly in the Stonewall and in the gay rights era, we certainly know that there were people who did not necessarily share that particular identifying trait who fought those battles. thinking of the commonality, thinking of the connectivity, to use the dean's term, right? Thinking that this is a battle about justice. But we tell the stories of like the women's rights movement, right? And then the black rights movement, and the gay rights movement, and in California, the Japanese American, and the Chinese American, and the Mexican American, and you put all those stories together, we do sort of one group at a time, right? But at the end of the day, there are all kinds of allies that are there. Moreover, there are all kinds of people who share more than one characteristic and who relate to this. So we tell the story in a group-based way, focusing on the trait. Blindness of the trait is what we're talking about. Right? But if we instead, people often criticize diversity discussions as, focusing on group rights, and as we know, and as we've learned in the Second Amendment case, all rights are individual, right? And of course, that in of itself is neither inherently a progressive or conservative turn. Right? Because you might remember, those of you who've already had constitutional law, when the Supreme Court says, actually, we think there's a right for a married couple to decide for themselves whether or not to bear or beget a child. And what's the state doing in that decision, right? It's initially a marital couple decision, and in a progressive turn, the court says, we think single people should be able to have that right too. If there's any right here to decide whether or not to procreate, it should be an individual right, a progressive turn to the individual. Versus what happens in Hiller, the two sides the Hiller I'm referring to is the gun rights case, and there the two sides take the opposite poles, right? The progressives are saying the way the Second Amendment is written, it refers to a well-regulated militia, which is how we would all use guns to defend ourselves as a collective, which would make it a group right. And it's the conservatives who say, you liberals want that all rights are individual. We want individual rights too, so that everybody should have an individual right to a gun, right? My point to you is, whether it's framed individually or group, there could be progressive or conservative tendencies. I think if we thought outside the binaries and didn't just make one list of binaries more progressive and one more conservative, which is what we do, by the way. Liberals are for anti-subordination, being conscious of the trait, making sure we wipe out the effects, considering the group, being forward-looking, understanding identity as fluid, and that we have multiple identities. Conservatives, if you're here, here's what you're for, just so you know. You're for assimilation, being trait-blind, color-blind, right? Only allowing any remedy in the law if there's proof of intent. Right? Not wanting to be classified or grouped according to that trait. Looking backwards, we should only do something to remedy discrimination if there's proof of past discrimination, so it's backward looking. All identity is fixed, with the exception of Michael Jackson. And it's singular. You look at one identity characteristic at a time, right? But my point as we have this conversation going forward is that we've got to basically, I think, not just keep having these as two lists of arguments that positions the two sides have staked out. But, and here I'm going to say something that is blasphemy in a progressive sense, so bear with me while I boldly go forward, okay? This is literally just as plausible as this, right? Okay? So as we're trying to undo subordination, we are indeed a nation, right? We are indeed a people, whether it's a globe or a nation, we can come back to that, right? But we're a people, and we are trying to find commonality. Assimilation is maybe just another way for looking for commonality, right? When we think back to Dr. King's statement, we don't want a child to be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of the character. That sounds a little colorblind, doesn't it? Right? We do want to make sure, at the very least, the government's not engaging in intentional discrimination, etc. It is important to remedy. And in the affirmative action debate right now that's before the United States Supreme Court, you'll notice that there's a little bit of flipping going on here, okay? The progressives are no longer only arguing forward-looking, they're kind of arguing backward-looking and saying, we do want to make sure that we're continuing to remedy all the effects of past discrimination, which is a little backward-looking, right? There is some point at which the law has to classify us, right? It's going to classify us, and to do that, it can't just be all fluid and like queer about it, as we like to say in the queer legal world, right? It can't just have fluidity. We got to figure out like how do we talk about these things. Language classifies, okay? So my point is, what if we thought beyond the two staked out positions? And I bring you back to, as I often do when I'm teaching this material, back to what Justice Harlan says in his dissent in Plessy v. Ferguson, right? Because he says there's no caste here, okay? We do not allow class and hierarchy in our society is what he's saying, right? And he also says we have to be colorblind, right? So in that same, like back-to-back sentences there in his dissent, Justice Harlan himself is putting both of these potential ideals on the board, right? And so it seems to me that in the battle of the dueling banjos, where we fight to the death over the means toward a more diverse, pluralistic, tolerant, inclusive society, I think we just completely lost sight of the ends, right? And the ends that the law and the social movements are trying to get us to, you guys articulated beautifully at the beginning, right? So if we're going to have a pluralistic, be a polity of people and engage in self-governance, we have on the good, positive side, use the law. If you look at the amendments to the Constitution, we mostly are not able to amend our Constitution, except for silly little technicalities like, when Congress can give itself raises and things like that, okay? But what did we amend our Constitution to do? We have amended our Constitution systematically, over the course of our nation's history, to broaden, to include in our polity. No more discrimination in voting based on race. No more 15th Amendment. No more discrimination in voting based on sex, the 19th Amendment, right? No more poll tax, discrimination in voting based on your socioeconomic status, right? No more discrimination based on age. We have, in fact, expanded the franchise. And the franchise is key because that is what defines us as a polity. If we're going to be a self-governing polity, we all have to be included in that. And that's something that we've been doing very systematically. Now, you guys are all familiar with, everybody's talking about the affirmative action case being before the United States Supreme Court. But what they're not talking about is Section 5, the Voting Rights Act case that's before the Supreme Court right now as well. And the Voting Rights Act is about whether or not the courts can continue to oversee those previously bad-acting states who overtly discriminated based on race for many, many decades, whether the courts can still engage in judicial oversight, judicial scrutiny, in a backward-looking way to make sure that there is not discrimination based on voting, okay? At the end of the day, it seems to me that's where we're still stuck, even on our franchise, even on who are we as a polity. And let me give you one final example on the importance of voting here and how it's been sort of the primary touchstone. You can see it was the touchstone for Seneca Falls. It was the touchstone certainly for Selma. And today, when you see all the issues about the claims of voter fraud and therefore the requirement of voter ID, we absolutely know what the survey data shows, which is that's going to disenfranchise poorer and disproportionately minority members of our polity, right? It's an attempt to exclude in that basic participatory sense, in a basic self-governing kind of sense, right? And it seems to me that at the end of the day, that's what we've got to fight. No matter what, we've got to have inclusion. And the inclusion is not going to come, I don't believe, this is my thesis of my presentation. The inclusion that we're trying to achieve is not going to come just by either the progressive stance or the conservative stance that we have, very rigidly set out in our equal protection and our anti-discrimination discourse. But the inclusion is going to come, it seems to me, when we look beyond that, back to the ends, right? And we open our minds to inform ourselves about what do we know from the data is going to better actually help us to achieve those ends. But that is not a decision that can be made based on exclusion. It's got to be one based on inclusion. And that inclusion, I would suggest to you, is always a constant conversation, which I don't think will ever go away, about how we're the same and how we're different. And I guess I would just end by saying, to me, would we want that conversation to go away? I mean, the whole point of Diversity Week and what we're really fighting for and celebrating here is that we're not all widgets, right? So as a last parting thought to you before I open it up here, I hope that you bring yourself here every day, okay? And I think one of the great concerns I have about what law school does to everybody in its reach is that widgetizing effect, to coin a term here, okay? That, you know, there's a way you're supposed to do it, and I'm supposed to have this thing called an outline, and how is a study group supposed to meet, and what is it supposed to look like, right? Instead, I encourage you to bring yourself to the law school classroom, bring your experiences, and not be afraid to sort of be yourself while you are, so that's the difference, bring yourself while you are learning the same set of skills and talents, okay? I don't know if any of you, if you didn't hear any snippet this morning, because maybe you were in class, of Justice Sonia Sotomayor this morning on KQED radio, right here, being interviewed by Michael Krasny this morning. It was an incredibly moving interview, and her biography is out, My Beloved World. And but he asks her what's the greatest obstacle she faced in her life, and she said it's the same obstacle that everybody faces. We all actually face the exact same greatest obstacle, our own fear, right? So I just encourage you. Get outside that comfort zone. Don't be afraid to say, you know, I understand everybody in the classroom is kind of nodding their head along to what the professor said, but I see it differently, or I feel it differently, or I experience it differently. That's diversity. So the fact that we bring you all in with these various traits and identifying characteristics, to me, does not enrich our environment unless you guys bring yourselves, okay? So that's my challenge, my bold challenge. Let me open it up. Questions, comments, bully pulpit criticisms. Yes, Professor McGee.
No, I just thank you very much. I apologize for being late. I had a dental appointment, but here I am. One question I have for you. Looking at the dichotomies that you put on the board.
Yeah.
Just a question about anti-subordination on the one side and assimilation on the other side, as opposed to subordination.
Right.
And I put it out there because the list as written clearly is a kind of a one that I think most reasonable minds can buy into your thesis that, you know, in a sense, both sides are too, you know,
it's plausible.
The truth is somewhere in partaking of both sides, right? As written, totally makes sense. The only question I have is, again, this insight that comes from the experience of many people, as you know, who are engaged in the progressive side of this, that on the other side of anti-subordination is not really assimilation. Assimilation fits somewhere on the side. You could put it on either side of what has historically been anti-subordination on one hand and subordination on the other.
Yes.
Right? I mean, there still actually are people who believe there are categories that have value implications, right?
Yeah.
So I think that is one of the places where I struggle when I look at this as a kind of a frame for really understanding what we're up against.
Yeah.
Yeah, that oppression piece and that desire for subordination of some. I think we do ourselves a disservice if we don't acknowledge that that's still part of the struggle.
I completely agree, 100%. It's still part of the struggle. And it doesn't go away. It moves, it's shifted, it reshapes itself, right? Bigotry does not go away, okay? And the desire to oppress, which I would suggest, by the way, deeply comes out of fear, right? I need to be on top of somebody, okay? And who am I going to be standing on if they're up here next to me, right? So, I mean, I do think that that's not going to go away. I completely agree. What I think is that within law and within our scholarly and intellectual dialogue, I think we've gotten stuck into not really understanding that there are conversations to be had. Right. So let me give you one personal example. Like when Amendment 2 was being proposed in Colorado, I went all over the state with my posse of people to protect me to all these places, and I am almost fearless, and I was afraid. Okay. I did only one talk in Wyoming. I was like, well, I'm never going there again. Okay. No offense, I do it for my own. Here's my point. One of the things that what I'm trying to do is make space for the conversation where we also don't say, which I think we do too much on the progressive side, to say, if you're not with us on anti-subordination, then you are for subordination all the way over here, right? But which I know you never do, Rhonda. But the point is, there are some people. Let's take Justice Scalia as our example, right? Who believes, I think, in his core, that he is trying to create. What does he say? We are all American. Right? We want you to be, and if you read the color of America has changed, you will see how, and those of you from immigrant families of all sorts know, like this whole tension between how do we assimilate and how do we not assimilate and how do we live both of those places at the same time is just part of the complexity of the human experience, it seems to me. And I do think that if we said, if I put it to you this way, some of us are obsessed with saying, hey, we're enough like you that maybe we can be voted into Congress. Maybe we could just vote for people to go to Congress. Maybe we could actually just be at the table. We're not that unlike you, right? We're talking about that commonality, that connectivity, right? And if I put on the other side, okay, we in fact want you to be, if you want to be the same, then we want you to be totally the same, right? So in other words, to a certain extent, there are times when both sides are talking about sameness, is what I'm really saying. And there are times when both sides are talking about difference. And if we could get to that conversation, right, which does not at all, that is, I think, that's the conversation I'm trying to help make space for, right? That is not at all to say, bigotry and oppression is what I'm for. I mean, if you're for bigotry and oppression, I can't have much of a conversation with you. And as I started saying, as I went around Colorado and talked to all these people who were like, I just assumed, like, I am going to talk to the homophobes. Here I go, okay? But they were not all homophobic, right? Some were. And I just put them over here. I was like, I don't know, you don't think I have a right to be on the face of the earth? So I'm not sure how we can have a conversation to those people. But how many are those people? And I think in mainstream society, though, we are stuck in this discourse, okay, where we're not seeing. Sometimes I want to be forward-looking, but you know what? I'm a little fluid. Sometimes I want to be backward-looking. Sometimes I care about effects, sometimes I care about intent, right? I mean, sometimes, I actually think at the end of the day, I'm more sophisticated, as far as and I think if you look at the litigation battles, most lawyers end up using tools from both sides of this list. We just cherry pick and use them selectively, as usual, right? Like the justices do, right? But if we could get out of this stuck debate and make space for, how can we actually have the two parts of the Justice Harlan conversation, who was no non-racist, by the way, okay, as we know, okay? No, totally, right, in the historical context. But nonetheless, he says, hey, no caste, but colorblind. How do we do that, right? How do we take into account our differences, right? Somehow take into account our differences without creating an oppressive hierarchy and subordination system. That, I think, is a challenge for diversity thinkers as we go forward, how to have that conversation more meaningfully outside of our stuck discourse, which I think has been hijacked very much by voices of bigotry over here, unfortunately. Yes, please, in the back.
You kind of alluded to it with your last point. I do agree that the possibility that both sides want the same thing and they're trying to pursue, it's just the means in which they're fighting over it. Mm-hmm. But as African-American male, to me personally, it just feels like the right side, not all people, but people in that camp, use that as a masquerade to get what they, at least some of them, truly want, which is no anti-subordination, or in some cases not even assimilation. And the only reason why I say that, I can't speak to particular cases, but it seems like they use it and it never comes out with the outcome that the other side or the left would have wanted. It always comes out with the outcome that they dislike. And it's those tools that they use to do it. So even if that isn't their intentions, it just seems like it has been hijacked by people who don't want that, and they use that as the means to get what they want.
Right. And don't get me, I agree, and I respect what you're saying and where you're coming from. I do not undermine or underestimate Look, let's take our most recent election. But for the comments about rape, who knows what would have happened, right? In other words, when that kind of, oppressive thinking, right, and, crazy thinking is just out in the open, I love that. That's a good day for me. I feel like let's get the bigotry out into the open, right? And in a meeting where people are saying, I'm not bigoted, but I'm upset about gay rights for the following reasons. How about my religious liberty? And, I can't just say to everybody in the room, if you're going to say religious liberty to me, then you're bigots, right? I can't say, okay, the bigots, you're over here. Now the people who are talking about religious liberty, let's have a conversation. So what I'm trying to say is, are there spaces where we can have conversations with more people about diversity than we've been having? And how could we do that? And what might that look like? Without at all, both to your comment, I don't know your name, and Professor McGee's comment here, without at all, please, I am not an apologist for, the people who are, the violent oppressors of the world. The way we're going to beat them, okay, is by showing them to be the very small minority that they in fact are, I believe. And to continue to, as you educate people and open their minds, I think they do get smaller. We all know that. Right? I mean, what's Justice Powell famously said, I didn't know a gay person, so there's a reason I voted to say that it's perfectly constitutional to criminalize sodomy. Right? And then he gets the letter, the next day in the mail from his, favorite former clerk who's like, well, you knew me, I worked for you, and I'm gay, And Justice Powell famously said, I didn't know I knew anybody who was gay, right? And then he later on says in a very famous speech, maybe I would have voted differently, right? And then, of course, that decision gets overturned after only 17 years on the books, et cetera, et cetera. So we know that exposure and diverse experiences with people who are not exactly like us helps open our minds, and I think brings bigotry down to, I really believe this. I'm like a total Pollyanna on this. It'll eventually, not be extinguished in humanity, but it's not going to be able to rule. We cannot go forward as a planet. Right? We cannot go forward as a planet with that kind of completely barbaric mindset of, just an oppressive mindset. So I think that's part of what we're trying to do. Caitlin, go ahead.
When you're talking about the multiple identities,
yeah,
it kind of made me think of, I forget the name of the case, but it's the homosexual who's a Boy Scout leader.
Yes.
And
Dale.
Yes.
Yes. James Dale.
They found that not allowing him to be a Boy Scout leader was fine because of his political identity, which they assumed from his sexual orientation.
Right.
So I think that raised a concern for me that we don't really understand this multiple identity, and we tend to assign different identities from what we do know about a person.
Yeah.
So, how to I don't think we figure out how to frame that conversation.
Yeah. The Supreme Court's like, James Dale, he's perfect Eagle Scout, Boy Scout master, perfect. He's perfect. Everything he does is perfect. He excels at everything, right? And then they find out he's leader of the Rutgers gay group, and they're like, oh, we thought we knew him. No, that can't be in the same body. You can't both be perfect Eagle Scout and Scoutmaster and gay activist, which is what they say about him. He's I just was being myself. I wasn't activating anything, right? Right? But we all do this, right? We all do this, right? We can all, who has not taken your pot shot at Clarence Thomas? I've taken way more than my share, okay? Right? I'm how does he even exist, right? How does he do that, right? I had the great, unbelievable pleasure last night of seeing Yo-Yo Ma perform, and not very far away from me was Condoleezza Rice, and I'm don't look at her, don't look at her. try not to say anything, because I have to do that to myself. I actually might have gone up and said, I need to talk to you. I don't know you, but I have some questions for you, right? Right? You see what I'm saying? I'm making my own assumptions about people, and I do it too, we do it too. I guess what I'm saying is hey, when I came to talk to you guys, I knew I was not talking to the people who are unconvinced, right? You guys are the convinced people. So what I'm trying to do in this talk is to say, what could we do differently? What could we do to think a little bit outside the way we all agree already? We talk about this and think about this so that we might actually be able to sort of expand who's in the conversation with us. Professor Iglesias.
So exactly a part of that point. So you, I think, thoughtfully and articulately say that law likes to handle things in chunks.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering, can you think of any particular examples where law does analyze, think through things holistically? I was scrambling myself to come up with one because I think what law does is it does it serially.
Yeah.
through framing, but I'm trying to think of a case where the court actually consciously, deliberately, explicitly is holistic and looks and says, okay, if we looked at it through this frame, not different claims like the healthcare law, tax versus something else, but frames. It's like, if we look at it through this frame, that way, if we look at that frame, you know what I'm saying?
Well, let me say a couple things in response to that. I think that's a fantastic question. I think that it's really a challenge, and I don't know what is a substitute for just context, right? So as soon as the law gets into mechanical classifications, it's just gonna, there are gonna be irrational applications of those stupid mechanical rules, right? Which is what we all study, and that's how we make a living, right? But it seems to me when the court looks at things in context, let me give you the best example from my work. As you guys know, who've had constitutional law, poverty is, being of low socioeconomic status, which almost everybody in America would agree is like a true disadvantage, is not considered to be a suspect class or given any judicial scrutiny by the courts at all. And yet, when the court wants to, it says, that person that's before us in this case is actually so poor that they're not going to be able to pay for what it would cost to be able to exercise this right. When they want to and they look at the reality of people's lives in context, then I think we get nuance, and I think that's really good. But let me turn it around, Tim, and say let me link this to Fisher. The Fisher case is the affirmative action case before the Supreme Court right now. The oral arguments were heard in October, right? And what's the progressive side on Fisher? Okay, we want to consider race. Okay, we want to be conscious of race. Okay, we need to be conscious of race. I would say, first of all, I'd say we are missing a great argument. I ask you this way, what would it look like for me to look at you as a whole person without your race? It's like, how do you subtract your race? Like, that's almost what the conservative position is, somehow subtract race, which would, to these points, whitewash everybody, okay? And then we'll look at you. Won't that be pretty? Lily white. It'll be much easier, cleaner, if you will, right? Okay, so but here's my point on what they're doing in Fisher. That's what they're arguing. I think it's sort of ridiculous, this notion that we could look at people holistically and individually as law school applicants without looking at your race, without knowing that as part of who you are. Because whether we like it or not, it's a salient part of identity. Agreed? Okay? Now, but here's what we haven't done. When the lawyers at the University of Texas are standing up there, and Justice Kennedy is hammering them, so tell me how you do this. Tell me what it looks like for race to be holistic. He's like, I don't know, right? I mean, he didn't say that, but he didn't have a good answer. He just stumbled and fumbled his way through it. And of course, that allowed room for Justice Scalia and the conservatives on the court to say, yeah, and on the front of every file is stamped the race, so everybody knows that they're making those holistic decisions in the process, that they are really trying to achieve some sort of proportion of racial minorities. My point is, we didn't have a good answer for that either, right? What would it mean like for us to think more holistically? And I think if we tried to theorize just how ridiculous it would be for me to say what the law does. Please, at this moment, you're just going to be your race. Okay, now you're your sex. Now you're your sexuality. Like we try to force you, anytime you're claiming before the court, into one thing at a time. But we all know that's not realistic. It's not context. It's not live, right? But how would we theorize an anti-discrimination or an anti-subordination agenda that would really holistically individualize us, truly, in a more meaningful way? What would that look like? I think that's a real challenge that I don't think we've done very well yet, is how I put it. So, yes, there was a hand over here. Yeah, go ahead. Jump in. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, and it relates to what you just said in fact with Professor Lee's comments in the beginning, which is I think a word that might be missing from your second column is meritocracy. Because I almost think that that's the guiding principle. If you look at anti-subordination as a guiding principle on the left, that it doesn't quite capture it perfectly. But
and yet, if you listen to Justice Sotomayor, which will be rebroadcast this evening, okay, since I'm now the public relations not unpaid employee for KQED, what she says is, no, she would put meritocracy over here.
Exactly.
Okay, she's like, hey, I just want a chance to do what I can do, right? And it's subordination that keeps me. So in other words, I think now I'm speaking for her, which is even worse than speaking for KQED, but I think she would say, I'm not giving them meritocracy.
No.
I want it over here, right?
Right.
And that's exactly my point. That is exactly my point, which is us to get out of these, that's in their column, right? Look, here's a, in common law we do this all the time. We do individual rights. They do federalism and separation of powers, right? I'm like, no we don't, because when you're in there practicing and you're in a dogfight in a constitutional law case, you better be ready to, wheel and deal on every single one of those doctrines. Don't give them federalism and separation of powers, right? And guess what? For the conservative movement has completely studied what the left has done on individual rights, and they're like, oh, that was fast. That was it. Like we could do that. We could do that better. We could do that in some of our cases, right? And they've done that on abortion. They've chipped it away. They've done it on gun rights, etc. Yeah, go ahead.
But I was just wondering, because the basis of rights and obligations are from statuses, usually, in the classical sense.
Yeah, yeah.
A lot of these statuses come from the fixing of these identities.
Yes.
Then, I guess my question is, if we're trying to go with a more fluid approach, wouldn't that, in a sense, kind of dismantle that? Because it seems to me that the purpose of having those singular things is so you could do having the statuses perfectly. Sorry, I don't know if that makes sense. I'm just wondering.
Yes, I think you are making sense, and to a certain extent, you're asking that same question, like, how would we function without our categories, right? How would we function without our categories? And my answer to that is, I understand, as I said at the outset, language is categorization. Language is classification. That's what we do. We do the Sesame Street thing all day long by saying, oh, it's this, it's not that, right? And yet, does subordination have to be part of that? Right? We can sort. I know 4-year-olds who can sort without, like, this one has to be high, this one has to be low. I'm going to make two things. They can't write these side by side. They got to be like, where did we get that? I really am, in a very simplistic kind of manner, all the way back to first principles, which is what you're asking about. Last word here from Professor McGee.
So the only thing I would add to this left column, and those who have spent any time with me know I'm going to say this, would be human dignity as the ultimate. I mean, we describe justice as the ultimate goal. I think dignity. And I don't. Is that equality that you're?
I put equality up there.
So equality
is what we've been talking about.
Equality invites a conversation about these ostensibly different entities that we want to equalize.
Yeah.
Whereas dignity moves us into a conversation that is very much in line with, and I actually completely agree with your basic idea that we need to broaden the many different ways that we have these conversations about this. And I want to say we can't avoid this piece about the continuing struggle against oppression and subordination as we do that. And for me, now I'm like more and more inspired to go back to making these arguments, because for 10 years I thought nobody's listening. But I do believe we're at a moment in history where we can begin to have the conversation we've needed to have for 10 years or longer, maybe since who knows when, about how exactly to articulate a way forward that actually gives all of us a sense of a free expression of who we are that is not bound to these fixed notions, these classifications, all of these things that we know that we all want to move away from. And for me, this notion of human dignity and a deep contextualization of what dignity requires in each instance is something I'm going to personally keep working on.
I agree with that, and I applaud that. Martha Nussbaum's work, for those of you who don't know this work, there's people who have started to give it attention from the elite schools that gives us cover to have this conversation in a more meaningful way. But it seems to me that as I always say, education. You guys are here, diversity in education. Education transforms lives. What does that mean? Your life. Who are you? What's your potential? What are your barriers? Where do you let your fear stop you? How can we release full human flourishing, full human capacity? That would be human dignity. And I would say that that's both individual and group, right? Don't necessarily. There's a way in which it's human dignity on the individual level, and there's a way in which it's on our social level. And we can't get. I just would take that though and say I would use that, run it totally to say. That is so much of a richer discourse than the way we have staked out our positions.
I completely agree.
Yeah.
I just mean you can't stop talking about ongoing oppression and the hard stuff. That's all.
I'm with you. Okay, the dean is going to have the last
And
word.
this is non-substantive in a sense, but it is about groups. And it's about students and faculty. And I can't tell you what a thrilling hour and 15 minutes this has been. We are blessed to have incredible students, the way you're engaged and the questions you ask. And what a faculty on this side of the podium.
That's
and
right.
there, looking at yourself.
Yeah, no, it's
Thank
all,
you.
thank you. It's an honor to be.
So on behalf of the Student Bar Association, I want to thank Professor Nice. What a fascinating and profound way to start the week. I want to invite everyone to continue to participate with us tomorrow back here at 12:30 p.m. Professor Baker, Economic Justice and the Role of Lawyers. And I would just end quoting Professor Nice, who said, "I hope you bring yourself here every day." I think that's the best way to start this week. So thank you, Ben, for coming, and we'll see you tomorrow.